I am going to say without any hesitation that if you want to speak to a complete expert on ITAD, Bo is the one. His professional trajectory took him to both ends of the ITAD sector, working what used to be leading ITAD vendors. I'm going to name a few of them: Integra, IT Renew, later on Aero Electronics and HP, among others. Engaging with these companies' customers has given him a front seat view of the challenges and opportunities facing ITAD managers in enterprises. 4 years ago, Bo crossed the line to join Starbucks to work in the IT asset management, specifically in retail infrastructure technologies. So I'm thrilled to speak to Bo today, and I intend to learn a lot. And I forgot to add that Bo is also an educator, being a certified instructor for ITAM. So Bo has the 360-degree view of the ITAD sector. So Bo, if you don't mind, tell us more about you so we can appreciate the depth of your understanding of the IT asset management space, and more precisely, this seemingly little function called ITAD, which is, as you know, a critical component of a company's IT infrastructure and ESG posture going forward.
Oh, absolutely. And wow, thank you for such a very nice introduction. So, Bo Guilbeault, I've had the good fortune of being in the technology space, really spanning multiple decades. I had the opportunity to work for Microsoft right out of college and spent about a dozen years there representing technologies when desktops were a brand new thing. Three-tiered architecture was a new thing. And so, it's been really, really fun to see how things have gone from ideas to, actual reality. And I was introduced to the IT asset disposition industry really at the Y2K, around the year 2000. And candidly, I really fell in love with the business model, as well as what that particular suite of services was trying to accomplish, not only from a business perspective, but also a sustainability perspective. And, sustainability is the new buzzword of the day. However, it really started back then. And, it's just been really fun to watch the evolution of the industry, number one. And it's also even more interesting because I now take the calls from the very same people I used to compete against. And I have to take that hat off and really look at, the suite of offerings and the services and the potential relationship truly from the customer side. So, the one thing that I've been told by a lot of the current ITAD suppliers is that I'm either a blessing or a curse, because the blessing is they don't have to educate me on ITAD and what that really means. Mm-hmm. But the curse part of it is that I really know the insides and outs. So I really negotiate pretty hard.
Absolutely.
But I try to be fair. And at the end of the day, reasonable people do reasonable things. So that's where we are. As I've mentioned, the ITAD industry is one that, even though I'm now a customer of those services, I still watch. I'm still very actively involved with that industry, with different suppliers that are out there, as well as, counselors and consultants like yourself that are really trying to educate the market, because that's the real opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. And it's going to get more interesting over time as we're seeing sort of convergence of all sorts of, big macro events or macro influencers that are hitting the market about at the same time: the AI, the ESG, the sustainability concept, moving from Windows 10 to 11, all sorts of things are taking place at the same time. Question is how this is going to turn out to be. I think this is going to be really interesting. But from your vantage point, Bo, having been on both sides of the sector, how do you assess the maturity of the ITAD industry on the supply side compared to the maturity of its clients? Do we have two equal partners, or is the balance tilting more in favor of the demand side in terms of maturity? Because the demand side, you have very big corporations with a lot of resources, with a lot of skill sets, with a lot of understanding, a lot of compliance requirements on one hand, and then you have a proliferation of family-owned, privately held companies that are trying to service these gigantic customers.
Yeah, you ask a really great question, and I thought about that for quite some time. And I would say that as far as the two sides being in balance right now, no, there's absolutely room for improvement, and more so on the customer side. Um, it really just depends on what your viewpoint is. I think in the ITAD industry itself, the primary processes that make up the services are pretty mature. That ranging from things I'll classify it as logistics management, freight haul, the receipt and testing of goods, the data security protocols, the potential remarketing, the proper environmental disposition based on the regulations that are pertinent. And then even the data that is being collected and reporting, I think, in my humble opinion, is pretty mature. When you look at the marketplace, as you say, there's lots of these companies, coming into the business. And so is there still a lot of opportunity? The answer is yes. The challenge on the customer side is, from what I hear from my peers, as well as what I've experienced personally, is ITAD is treated more as a project. So it's like a one-time event and we're over with it. And that's where larger organizations, and when I say larger, you could certainly talk about mid-size, you can talk about government, city, all of those type, as well as the Fortune companies that are out there, that with the volume and velocity, that is going to determine whether or not you really should invest more and actually have a resource dedicated to the IT asset disposition side. And the question is, where does that person sit?
In terms of the way ITAD is perceived in enterprises, quite often I have used the term, when defining ITAD, I use the term orphaned for a number of reasons, Bo. One of it is the fact that it's usually housed in IT departments, and 75% of the time that's the case. But IT departments, IT managers may not be fully trained, fully skilled at bringing together these various functions that are needed to operate a good ITAD program. I'm thinking about compliance issues. I'm thinking about environmental issues. Think about managing the financial aspect of it. These are skill sets that your typical IT department guy may not have. Not his fault. It's the way things are. What would it take for large companies to understand that managing an ITAD operation going forward might require a different type of a job function? Would it make sense to sort of within an IT department have a person that champions the end of life with a different skill sets than the type of skill sets that they're used to, buying assets, implementing a rollout, managing patches, managing software updates, etc. ITAD seems to be a more complex operation with a lot less resources.
Yeah, no, I would agree with what you're saying. And I think that that's the challenge of organizations overall, right? And where I would point to is, an IT director that's, let's say, in charge of the data center, right? They're thinking about uptime, right? And any disruption to their uptime is a problem. And so, usually when you're thinking about kilowatts per hour and the movement from one technology to another, it's like, hey, get that old stuff out of the way because our business still needs to move forward. And if we're 365, 24/7, then, any interruption to that is a nuisance. And so this is where I look at organizations to say, well, do you have an actual asset management program? Because if you have an asset management program, then you have the opportunity to further educate either an individual or individuals, plural, depending on how you want to set up that program. And usually what ends up happening, as you've stated, is you may have somebody in sourcing that has the responsibilities all of a sudden to go out and find an IT asset disposal company. But wait a second, sourcing's talking to the OEM where they're negotiating pricing on that new device that they want, we want to potentially deploy in our organization. And of course, the OEM is going to step in and say, well, we certainly can offer these type of services to you. Then you have potentially another layer where you've got a value-added reseller who also works with those OEMs to provide services to larger organizations. And they come at you and say, well, by the way, we offer IT asset disposal services. And then you've got these other organizations, right, that focus specifically on IT asset disposition. And so then it becomes an exercise in, well, okay, what's the least barrier to enter, right? And so if I'm in sourcing and I think I can impact a discount by saying, hey, sure, Dell, IBM, Lenovo, Microsoft, whomever the manufacturer is, if you'll take these back and you give me an extra couple percent on the front side, ooh, guess what I just made? I saved this, X amount because I negotiated a better deal, right? And so it becomes really crucial to peel that onion back further. And, in this day of, uncertainty, recession, all of these different things, businesses and all of us individually, right? We're looking at what are the dollars coming in and then how are we going to spend our dollars appropriately? And so when you look at the IT asset disposition service or that discipline within the company, it really is one of the few where not only do you have a potential to protect the company and the brand, but you also have the potential to drive revenue. And that's a real key element because, revenue, if you sell an asset that you own, right, and you've already depreciated it to zero, well, that's a new revenue stream. And so a lot of organizations, well, a lot is a big word to say. I'll just say the majority of organizations and the people that I have talked to haven't really gotten to the point where they've talked to their finances and really sat down and said, here is an opportunity to impact our bottom line in a different way versus just simply in the ITAD industry, there's no invoicing and there's no service fees. Right. And that's a different discussion based on the way that you state, because I think that is one of those elements that can harm your IT asset disposition provider.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think what you depicted, Bo, is a very complex ecosystem of players, or of type of players, on both sort of the supply side and on the demand side. Let me just share with you some tidbits. When you survey companies on what's their priority when they think about ITAD, the vast majority would say, well, data security is the right thing, and so we outsource or we hire companies based on our data security requirements. Number one. Number two typically is the environment. So the compliance aspect of it tends to sort of come to mind when they prioritize their ITAD decisions. Ironically, data security is also a reason why the companies that don't outsource. The argument makes absolute sense. They say, we have compliance requirements that require us not to let anybody, no third-party company, into our data infrastructure, big banks, and so that's another point of confusion. how do you, how do you sort of face these guys? Depends on your go-to-market strategy and what language do you speak?
Yeah, I know. I totally agree with you, and it's really interesting because, you know, obviously working for the organization I do, we're a pretty big recognizable name, and it's amazing to me on how many of the folks trying to generate a cold call, whether that's through the telephone, through LinkedIn as an example, or an email, what have you, right? Um, right now, the big buzzword is sustainability. So that's one. Hey, we've got great ESG reporting. But what's really, really interesting is I would tip the scale that most of the folks trying to win business, the first thing they lead with is we can sell your assets, or we can provide you a greater monetary return than anybody else in the industry. And that, to me, that's a real interesting perspective, considering, right, that legislation from a national perspective, is, the SEC is looking at the disposal process and the proper handling of, data bearing type of devices. You have, those entities out there that are looking at ESG reporting and, what are companies of size and stature doing from an environmental, a social, and a governance perspective. And then you literally have it from a global perspective, right? Like GDPR, which has been around now for a while. Mm-hmm. Now that's coming in to, where the state of California is, about to try and pass some legislation specifically around data. You look at the environmental side of it, only 25 states right now in the United States actually have laws on the books related to environmental disposition of e-waste. So there's still even some maturity aspects that need to happen. And so, it's just a really, really interesting world because, having sat in the shoes of somebody doing business development, the tactics that are being used today, the availability to people with social media and all of these things. Like, I looked at your post the other day about Twitter and the ITAD followers based on those companies and things of that nature. And I thought, wow, that's really, really cool. And it was a little surprising to me, the companies that were listed there. Right. Well, I should say in some cases I was surprised, and in others I was like, oh, totally makes sense. Right. So the biggest thing I believe that can happen is organizations need to sit and really look at, okay, what is our true exposure to, the challenges of, let's just say, the populace, right? Because, they stay statistically, right? You have a breach, it's 20% market cap hit, plus then you get all the fines that are associated to it, depending on, who was at fault. People lose jobs, businesses go out, all of that kind of stuff. You look at the companies that export e-waste illegally, they end up in jail, they pay fines, their business shuts down. And yet the companies that hired them, all of a sudden they're now thrown into oh boy, now we need to go find something or a new supplier. And so it really, really, I think that IT asset disposal, depending on how you like to term it, is gaining notoriety in all organizations of all size. The real issue is that everybody thinks their plan is working great. Because if the wheel ain't broken, don't necessarily fix it. And, just from different experiences that I have, with organizations that, they're like, hey, it's not costing us anything. Well, is it? you're not being invoiced, which sure, that may, solve a certain problem or a challenge in your organization, but are you leaving residual value on the table because of the relationship that you have? And I think that, I love the fact that OEMs are getting more involved, but, they have challenges with their programs, just like, any potential supplier that you negotiate and work with has challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, when you look at sort of the supply side on the ITAD, you have broadly three sort of groups of companies, or three groups of business models that I've identified. The most prevalent one, the biggest one, is basically an OEM, a leasing financing company, a big company that sells hardware, that has a services agreement with the customer. And in this case, you would argue that everything is taken care of. If only that's the case, I think that's the genesis, the beginning of the ITAD industry. It's having big IBMs, etc., having the responsibility to bring their assets back after 3 years of lease. So that's probably where it started several decades ago. It's hard to assess the number, but based on our surveys, random surveys of a couple thousand companies, that's about 45%. 45% of large enterprises, and that includes large public sector entities as well. So the Dells and HPs of the world, and CSI Leasing, eventually IBM financing, they have a substantial role to play in that world. So the second group is basically everybody else, the pure play, the ones that are in the ITAD world, that makes those cold calls, that have their sales organizations that try to get the rest. And then you have probably about 17%. Our last survey suggests that 17% of large US corporations don't engage in hiring third-party companies. Whatever that means, they do it themselves. You go down into the rest of the survey, and it'll sort of point to where the problem is and what do they do. And a lot of it is we store it, we get rid of it through trash, we use municipal waste,
or we donate it. Yeah,
we donate it. Absolutely, we donate it to charities. We donate it to employees. You name it. Is that a picture that emerges with you that you've seen over the years? Because you've worked with the Integras, so you've been you've been in the forefront of trying to go after accounts. You've worked with the HPs of the world that are much more sort of leaning towards sort of services contracts. Does that picture sound right to you?
So I would absolutely say yeah. And when you're looking at the ITAD industry, when you talk about leasing or device as a service, a subscription type base, right? Those are financial models. And the one thing that I would caution, a corporate user is, regardless of whether you lease a device or you have a device under a subscription model, you're still responsible for the data that resides on that particular device. And so the real question there is, you'll have an internal process, which, you have a process or policy that says we wipe all of our data bearing devices. Okay. Well, how do you, justify that, defend that, if in fact your process broke at one point? So demonstrating due diligence is certainly an element that I always talk about, regardless, to my fellow peers in asset management, as well as, IT asset disposition interested folks. Because at the end of the day, in the court of law, right, you have to make sure that you exercise due diligence. And that means not only, okay, if I had a process internally, then I send it to a third party, which also runs a data security protocol to it, and I get data from them. Well, now I've just put in a second step that basically says, hey, my processes also are working, because you can compare data and say, you know what, it's really interesting. And, there's a lot of organizations out there that will, throw some statistics out that say, you might wipe your devices, but, 35% of the time you miss them. And that's where you need us. You need us to pick up that 35% and validate, because regardless of how big you are, you cannot self-indemnify yourself, right? And so then you look at, all right, when you're in those subscription models or you're in those leasing models, right, there's contractual terms to that. And what happens when you exceed it, right? So you still continue to pay these fees. And then, what happens to those devices that were lost, stolen, were returned damaged for whatever reason? Now there's penalties that are associated to that. So you can look at the disposition industry and those suppliers also as an outsource to your own internal to validate things, so that there's no, funky monkey business going on, in an internal type of situation. I also look at, the donation element. Doing something good for fellow man is always preferred. The ability to reuse devices as they were originally manufactured, really awesome. If you can use the sum of parts to create a new product that can be used, outstanding, right? Because that's going to be good for the environment. What you have to also be careful of, though, is, are you unknowingly and inadvertently pushing a disposal effort to the very charitable organization that has limited funds and resources to begin with? And so, having the ITAD industry be, again, a third party to help facilitate those donations are outstanding. And some do it better than others, but none, regardless, that's one of those efforts that certainly can be supplied. And then, you look at the ability to remarket. So what's the value of that 5-year-old laptop? What's the value of that 4.5-year-old Blade server? What's the value of, that iPad that's, 3 years old? And so, generally speaking, the folks in the ITAD industry have at least a good pulse on what values are. And so now it gives you an opportunity to do the math for yourself and your organization to say, okay, if we try to market these things, or if we want to run our own internal, employee sale type of event, well, at least we now have a starting point. And I think that that's really where the successful ITAD suppliers out there, they really are taking the time to help their customers understand the math associated to all of the services. Because it's real easy. I used to use this example all the time about data security. So you might have an internal process, but is it your top engineer that's really going to be doing the data wiping on a Friday? No, it's probably being delegated to someone of a little lower, certainly capable, but, let's just say it's a fresh college graduate, totally understands technology, totally understands. But, all of a sudden you've got an event where these laptops have to go out on Monday, and all of a sudden here comes 150 new laptops on Friday at 4:00. And guess what? That engineer happens to have a hot event for that night that requires their attendance. No one's looking at them. You look at two laptops that are closed side by side. There's no visual indication which one's been completely wiped and which one hasn't. So, human nature can sometimes have it where they'll push it over into the, yep, it got done pile. And that's how, you have these type of situations that get companies in trouble. It's not that they're doing it on purpose. It's sometimes just literally human nature. So that's where the ITAD industry comes in. Now, data security protocols that require destruction on site, that's a whole nother thing. And I'm I'm not in the position to tell an organization that's right or wrong. I think that the wiping technologies that are out there, in my humble opinion, are very good. It's where the process breaks down. And that's where you have the troubles. So if you solidify the process, which then in turn goes back to, should I have an ITAD professional inside of my organization, part of my hardware asset management program? Well, that alone is well worth, having someone that's very educated in what's going on within that industry.
Yeah, and so when a company decides to run through the economics of a secondary market and hyperscale components that need to go into the secondary market, as you pointed out, iPads, for example, etc. Who is equipped to do that? Is this housed within the procurement organization? Is it the procurement folks that are sort of running all these scenarios in collaboration with an ITAD company to understand the timing? The timing is important. I just read, I'm doing a quick analysis on Iron Mountain's most recent results, and they did see that a number of their clients decided to be active in the first quarter of this year after a quarter or two previously of very dormant activity, because they didn't want to get into a market where they're not generating value. All of a sudden, component prices are up, and they're feeling that they can do something about it and generate some income. Who is typically involved in helping or collaborating with the ITAD company to understand all of this?
Yeah, this is where it varies from company to company. Mm-hmm. Because generally speaking, when you're going out, and if you're fortunate enough to have purchasing department, if you're fortunate enough to have an asset management team, if you're fortunate enough, right, to have business analysts, right, help you with these types of things, it's great. But if you're the poor IT director that's now been asked, hey, we're evaluating technologies, we're going to start looking at, we've done our evaluations, we now have picked this widget. And so you're at the whole time talking to the OEM that manufactures that widget, you're talking potentially to your value-added reseller that may facilitate that transaction. And that's who you're relying on in a lot of cases to provide you those elements of, well, hey, did you think about, and in the mind of an IT director, if they don't look at it from the perspective of, hey, I just am going to have stuff out, I don't really know, to me, it doesn't have value anymore, right? Because I'm moving on. That's why we're moving on to the next, next device, the next iteration, whatever the case may be, because we want to accelerate the return on that investment. We want to push our business further, farther, faster to become more profitable. So when you look at that end of life, a lot of folks just look at it and even think about it from your own personal consumer perspective. I brought this up at a sustainability conference once. The term recycling, right? The first thing I thought of living in the state of Washington is I've got the green bin that my general garbage goes into, and I got my blue bin that my recyclables go into. And then, the waste management truck comes, picks up the green one, and the waste management truck picks up the blue one. And I know I pay a service fee for that to happen, right? My only responsibility in that is to make sure the proper things get in the right receptacles and it ends up, where they can get to it from the street. So when you think about the electronic side is where it becomes rather unique, because the fact that, the traditional life cycle is anywhere from 3 to 7 years, depending on the model of how you depreciate your assets, or whether you CapEx, OpEx, depreciate, run the subscription models, things of that nature. Well, if you're using a device that technically can go on for 10, 12, 15 years, well, okay. let's see what it costs, because the fact of the matter is I've got to test it. Well, do I have the abilities to test it other than just turn it on and everything looks like it's functioning? Then do I have the proper licensing to do the appropriate data security side of things? And then do I want to take the time to clean up every one of these devices, then go out and represent them to the highest bidder, or try and sell them in a retail type of environment, which takes resources to do? And then you've got the packaging of those products. So when you start thinking about that and putting the mathematics in an organization together, again, it's going to really boil down to the volume and the velocity of the devices, because there's very large organizations that have their own warehousing where they're doing that kind of mitigation of device movement, right? Then you have others that they're taking advantage of virtual warehouses, and they try to have those type of ITAD resources on site, but there's certain organizations that will use a technology until the proverbial wheels fall off. So at that point, it's a pure recycling. So the term I'm going to use is do the math. The best suggestion I can give to any organization, whether they're moving forward with a new technology, either introducing it into their environment, they're uplifting an existing technology, that you want to look a little bit into the future and say, okay, is this a data-bearing device? The answer is yes or no. Or is this a device that has hazardous materials as a part of it? Yes or no. Do we think that there'll be marketability at the end of our life cycle based on, similar type of technologies that are out there? And then last but not least, hey, we're already used to paying for disposal. I mean, this is, I'll be real candid here. I used to go into the senior level executives and I would always challenge them with their electronic waste. I would say, I don't know if your program will be profitable or not. I can tell you we can generate revenue, potentially. I will also tell you that we will help mitigate the specific risks that are associated to it. Now, I challenge you to go to waste management and tell them, hey, we're about to, have 20,000 more people in this location. And, since we have such good velocity with you, hey, we want to negotiate a better deal. No, there's costs associated to it. And I think that this is where the ITAD industry has a very, very unique opportunity to really go in and say, there are services that are associated and they are valuable to you. And here is what the math truly looks like. And internally, for me, I use the term right-sizing spend. And the reason why I use right-sizing spend versus, cost avoidance or reduction in spend is, if you go to an executive and you say, if you invest $1 million and in 2 years it's going to turn into $10 million worth of revenue, they'll invest in that all day long for that type of return. So what you have to make sure is to say, what we're doing here is we're investing in a program so that we can not only gather the data points, but it also has us the ability to right-size the spend associated to our TCO calculations as far as doing the right thing, because no major organization out there is purposely doing the wrong thing. Absolutely. I think that, in the case of, the most recent, where Morgan Stanley, obviously is the unfortunate company that gained a lot of press, that was based on human error, a process breakdown.
I just came up with what could be an interesting metaphor, and I'm just going to pass it through you and see what you think. Could ITAD be considered the canary in a coal mine? In other words, a poorly managed ITAD is a reflection of a bigger problem that's taking place in the IT asset management in general, in IT departments? Or could you have a dismal ITAD, but a fantastic IT management? I'm assuming that certainly was the case with Morgan Stanley. I mean, they have such an effective IT strategy. It's core for their business. On the other hand, when it comes to end of life, they just couldn't do it. Or in this case, clearly, ITAD, a poor ITAD is not really the canary in a coal mine. It just happens to be the case.
Sure. No, I think that the way I look at this is my personal view. When I'm looking at whether it's a process, a program, the vendors, the suppliers that are helping, even the folks that are, a part of the project per se, right? I look at it from the perspective of governance or operational efficiency. And I'm going to say this in this way, inspecting what you're expecting. Okay. Mm-hmm. The second lens that I like to look at is the financial impact. And that's where I go back and saying right sizing spend. And then the last is the inventory itself, which really means defending chain of custody. You need to understand any device that you own or are responsible for. Where is it? Is it active on the network? Is it not active on the network? If it's not active on the network, why? Is it assigned to an individual? Is it assigned to a department? All of these attributes, right? All of these data points are super important. Now, in the case of large organizations that have outstanding IT management, if they're looking at the OEM relationship and they're saying, hey, we're spending, X amount of millions of dollars with you on, buying the new equipment. Hey, great. If you'll help us out on the back end, we're going to assume, right, that you've done all your homework as an organization because you, Mr. OEM, depending on the size and stature of you, have as much skin in the game as we do, mm-hmm. right? And then, you can take that all the way down to all of the different players, right? A policy is only as good as it's enforced. So if no one's enforcing it, is it really a policy? Right. So if you have an ITAD, a disposition discipline in your organization, if you're not inspecting what it is that they're doing, do you really have an effective disposition program? If you're looking at it from the purview of, do we have someone that's doing the effort? Okay, that's a checkbox. Oh, what is the cost associated to? Are we generating money, or are we net neutral, or is it costing us? And I think that what happens is, if you're getting checks back, all of a sudden, everybody looks like a hero, right? Oh, our asset disposal program is so great because, we got another check last month, for the assets. But yet no one looks at the reporting. No one cross-checks the fact that, well, I won't say no one because that's a very bold statement, but I will say the vast majority of people do not actually audit the results of what is even being provided by their third-party suppliers. And that's a real key element. And I think that, that's going to become even more and more important in Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, really organizations of any size and stature, public or private, that have a prominent position within, the industry that they compete in, as well as the providence of which they operate from.
Yeah, and I do confirm, Bo, something that you just mentioned, that's sort of the preeminent importance of that check coming back to the company. We, in our surveys, we use techniques to really drill down to the point where you sort of corner the respondent to tell you exactly what they think. And so it goes this way. Almost everyone says our priority is data security. Almost everyone says the second priority is the environmental stewardship, and third priority is the dollar sign. And the dollar sign, you qualify it either as cost containment, or in most cases, for those that get revenue sharing, it's about revenue sharing. So number one, data security. Number two, environment. Number three, money. But when you go down into the nitty gritty of their thinking process, of the psychology, they find it more thrilling to get $100,000 check than to be more diligent when it comes to data security. The data security is sort of a given. It's something that, you know what, I don't know the process. The ITAD company is going to take care of it. But I'm going to try to be on top of the game when it comes to the dollar, because in most cases, it may be a junior analyst or a junior technician or someone or a junior manager who will look good.
Oh yeah,
Going
no,
back
you're
to his
right.
boss and say, look, here's $100,000. I brought you money, but at the end of the day, to your point, I think all of these evolving macro events are going to push that aside, and they're going to re-emphasize the need for better due diligence in other things. Data security, number one, we know that is inevitable. We have a lot of federal mandates on data security. We have a lot of state mandates on data security. We have Europe, Asia, all of these places require people to be on top of their data security aspect. And for many companies, it doesn't matter the cost. Almost, it doesn't matter the cost. Big financial companies that have a sort of similar business model as Morgan Stanley, I think it doesn't really matter to them if it's going to cost them $100,000, $1 million. It's
No, you're absolutely right. I'll share a story. So there was an opportunity where I was working with an organization, and they wanted to donate laptops, and essentially the laptops were spread out. So, it was a wide geographic opportunity or logistical nightmare. And so this entity negotiated with a charitable organization, which was great. And I encouraged that. But my real question to them was, well, how are you handling your data security? And they're like, well, these devices don't hold anything. And I'm like, okay, well, did you go to your cybersecurity team and validate that? And they're like, well, oh, yeah. I said, well, let's do this. Let's get the cybersecurity team, someone involved from that, and have a discussion. And so once we had the discussion, they realized, oh, yeah, we do need to wipe these particular devices, right? Prior to. So then all of a sudden now it became a budget question. And for the organization to do that internally versus outsourcing it, great big difference, right? It was far more expensive for them to try and do all of that work than to simply outsource it and, have a box program, go pick it up. And then now all of the particular devices are centralized, and, you can work with that charitable organization and say, you know what, even though there's, X amount, hey, some of those fell out of the wayside. We've already taken care of those. So every one of the devices that you're going to get, it's functional. And you know what? On top of that, as our organization, we'll also offer an extended warranty, right, for that on behalf of our client. And so that's where the importance of doing the math. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of folks that have those experiences on the ITAD supplier side, as well as those on the client side. And fortunate for me, in this particular instance, this was just one of many that I was exposed to, having the experience that I had being on the supply side. There's very few things that happen today that honestly haven't happened previously. Now, there's a few more challenges here and there. And I think that organizations are starting to force ITAD companies to be even more transparent than they used to be. The idea of the circular economy, right? You ask people about circular economy, and they kind of look at it and they say, well, I think I know what it is, but you have to explain that to them as well. And I've been in I've taken the time to actually read ESG reports from some very leading companies. And the other thing that's really interesting to know is, environmental, social, and governance needs means a lot of things to a lot of different organizations. If you're an airline, well, environmental isn't necessarily how much e-waste did you properly steward. It's how is your carbon footprint related to those jets that are flying up and down? How many aluminum cans were you able to recycle, and the paper, the plastic cups did you recycle off those thousands of flights that you have going daily? So, those are the pressures. Those are the things that everybody wants to know. And so I, in my humble opinion, believe that the electronic waste is coming up the ladder. It's starting to climb in its importance. And organizations that have an asset management program, if they're not reporting on the disposal, then they are missing out on a huge opportunity to really enlighten senior executives.
Lately, one of the statements that I make to most of folks in the industry when they talk about the importance of ITAD and ESG and environment, I say, in the entire ITAM discipline, what else is more important than ITAD when it comes to the environment? And I would argue what else is more important than in ITAD than when you deal with data security. I mean, this is basically an opportunity for data to escape. Is an opportunity for you to be more a pollutant than anything else in the life of the device. I mean, there's so much resources that are being spent when it comes to the procurement phase. There are millions of white papers, data analysis, technical papers, presentations coming from everywhere, from the analyst firms to the third-party white paper makers to the OEMs. There is a lot that we talk about when it comes to the life of the device. When it comes to this very important end of life, then you see an enormous deficit of information when we know this is one of the highest point of exposure. It's towards the
sounds like we need to write a book.
we do. We absolutely do. It goes back to the business, partly to the business models that ITAD, that companies that are involved in the ITAD space have. I mean, you have broadly, you have the large corporations, the OEMs. The OEMs do it because, well, they have to do it. They are doing it because they have a service agreement.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. Well, plus it's an easy discussion, because if you're about to spend, let's just say, for the sake of an example, if you're about to spend $20 million on brand new product, and you can write in the disposal part of that as part of that 20 million, and instead of 20 million, it's it's 19 million, right? All of a sudden, man, everybody looks great because you negotiated $1 million savings. But what they didn't understand is, man, if they would have actually put it through the process, we could have generated 2 million in potential revenue. So it's there. I don't think there's a whole lot of people in the corporate side or the customer side that understand that math yet. They're doing it from their respective purview, which is totally understandable. Even calculating TCO can be an interesting exercise with organizations, right? Because they'll go, this is what it cost. Did we buy a warranty? Okay, so that's up there. Now, how much did it cost us to actually go deploy it? How much did it cost us to train the users to actually use it? Now, over the lifespan, how many times do we have to touch it in repair? And then, oh, by the way, what's it going to cost to decommission it? What's it going to cost to actually service it in the proper way? It's a very complex equation that you can simplify, right? And it really does boil down to a math and resource equation for the typical consumer, meaning the corporate entity. I can look and say, if I had the dedicated resources, here is what my cost for that is, and estimate out a project timeline. And then you look at it and compare that to a third-party supplier and say, wow, what might take us 60 days, they do in 30. their cost of scale, because this is what they do day in and day out, their learning curve is much lower. They understand this, right? They have the expedited way of doing it. So when I do that math, I go, financially for the organization, much, much better. And, people don't necessarily want to do that level of calculation, right? And I get, just in my own day to day, I always say, well, I'm going to do the math. I'm going to put numbers to this. And when I don't know the numbers, then, I'll basically state, hey, this is a wild card here that can come into play, but here's, as an example, here's the operational cost of the asset that it's, in our fleet. Here's the future disposal cost. Oh, by the way, here's the current market valuation of that particular device. If we were to go ahead and, let's just say, had some catastrophic event and had to get rid of things en masse. So now you can do some really neat calculations to even help with life cycle management. And, like I said, most IT directors, most procurement people, even business folks, right, that are out there trying to just, how do we save as much cost as we can? How can we be efficient in that? And how can we generate better profitability for the organization? This is a discipline that, even though ITAD has been around for quite some time, it's really making its way. And even asset management has been around for a long time, but IT asset management specifically as a discipline is growing, and the caliber of people coming out with that type of experience and certifications that are available, that's what's going to change the dynamic. I think we're probably still, maybe 5 years away from where, you asked about equilibrium. I think 5 years or less to bring that more to par. Absolutely there.
And if I were to guess who's going to drive this, that would be the pure ITAD companies, the pure play. The reason I say that, Bo, is because you can be an OEM, but an OEM, this is not your core business. And what have I noticed when I look at the OEMs, when I look at leasing financing companies is probably even worse, because not worse. I mean, they're excellent companies, by the way. Some of these companies are getting wonderful reviews from their customers. When you look at their employee reviews, they are also really rated very high. They're very good. Granted, they're multi-billion-dollar corporations. They have a lot of resources.
Sure.
But when you look at their ITAD or ITS at disposition divisions or units, they're way down there in the hierarchy of leadership. Which means if you are the head of ITAD, if you really want to get the resources, you've got to go several layers up to try to get some money to get a marketing campaign, to do a number of things. On the other hand, when you look at the way they structure their go-to-market, the way they pay commissions to their sales folks, it's not as great as the type of commissions that people that sell brand new equipment or whatever are getting. Which means that now all of a sudden the commission that you get from ITAD, from selling ITAD, is totally irrelevant. It's kind of buried down there. So I'm ruling out that innovation in the sector is going to come from these large companies. Totally ruling that out.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think that, when you look at the asset management associations, the different associations specifically to ITAD, conferences that are coming out, and that folks can attend, and even look at some of the platform tools that are out there, right? They do look at life cycle and end of life cycle.
Sure.
So I think it's going to be a combination, but when you talk about OEMs and their programs, having had the opportunity to work for a major OEM in their asset upcycling division, you can have all the capabilities in the world, but yet even the financial models that are being operated on, the types of deals that they want to do. Yeah, it's interesting. Having gone through, the integration of a roll-up, when working with Aero Electronics and having some really strong ITAD companies that competing against each other all had very successful businesses. And then when you take all of those together and bring it into one entity, the question is, okay, do you allow these, do you allow the ITAD business, which is unique, run, or do you try and make it a catalog item? Do you try and make it, something that traditionally it's not? It truly is a services business, and it truly has calculatable costs associated to it. But because of that residual value, that secondary market, the chance to bring revenue back, that's what muddied the water, right? A little bit. And I think that, to your point, I mean, in my humble opinion, OEMs could win 100% of their ITAD opportunities if they wanted to.
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
So, how they structure it is how they structure it. Then you look at even, some of these larger organizations, like I look at Iron Mountain, since you mentioned them earlier in the podcast. Iron Mountain, that's a natural evolution.
Absolutely.
To their business, right? So they're known for security. They're known for destruction. They have a terrific logistics setup. So do they have the opportunity to really be super successful? Yeah. But the market's going to determine that,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Now going back to, you mentioned you worked for one of these OEMs, and I have to say that's probably the only OEM that I know of that has its own facilities. The other ones, I mean, the extreme example, and I'm not going to name the company, is a company that has no facilities. Management is outsourced to someone like Flextronics. Labor is outsourced to someone like Manpower. Their job is essentially going through spreadsheet and come up with all sorts of economic models that work. They are a giant in this business. They do very well. They have a huge reputation. They're global, but they don't touch nothing. They don't touch anything.
Well, and that's where you have to read the contracts, and that is another interesting element because, in my particular case, obviously I understand all of that, having experienced it firsthand, and so, customers out there, you might strike a deal with an OEM, but you realize when you read through their liabilities, they exonerate themselves. They basically say we subcontract this, and if the subcontractor screws up, well, it's really on them. It's not so much us. And so, there's a lot of different things in the legalese that if you don't know what to look for, right? And so what I would say is this, if I were to rank the maturity of knowledgeable people in corporate America specific to ITAD, it's still in its infancy. Okay.
Absolutely.
You've got a few people right now that know how to run, but for the vast majority, they're literally just crawling right now and they're learning more. And, until they're forced into a position, right, where they have to make a change, or they have to at least consider alternatives to what they've traditionally been doing, or someone in the organization is introduced and challenges the current train of thought, right? It's going to continue to mature. And to your point, it's still on the shoulders of the ITAD suppliers to really truly educate their customers on the business itself. And I'm not just saying, hey, we sell stuff for more, or we process things faster. better, stronger, all of those type of things, because until you go see it personally, I used to challenge people when I was doing the business development work. I always invited them to come to the processing facility, but before we would go, I would always ask them, okay, so now tell me what your perception of this processing facility is going to look like. And I will tell you, the vast majority of the time, they described an auto scrapyard, or a traditional junkyard, or, and when they come into the facility and they see that, wow, the floors are swept, everything is organized, there's a true flow. They see the technicians, they see the people, they see the security elements, all the things that you're looking for. All of a sudden now it's like, okay, this is a serious business. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not outliers out there that need to get to that point. But, that's what I'm saying. The good companies, the solid companies, the big companies, they're trying their best right now to educate as best as possible. There certainly could be more. And I think podcasts like this one, give folks a chance to, learn a little bit more. I mean, I find it interesting in some conferences that I've gone to, which, you see a lot of the salespeople for these ITAD organizations trying to learn more so that they can also be better in the way that they educate. So, and I think that, you mentioned the ITAM organization, having an organization that has a certification process that, you can demonstrate known knowledge, right? That's good for the industry too. And it's good for
Absolutely.
folks to gain. And so as those things continue to proliferate and sustainability holistically starts to, continues to proliferate in the way that it is, it starts at home, it starts at school. How many of us, personally have devices still sitting in a desk drawer? Even though you and I might be in the industry, chances are we probably have something somewhere.
Oh, and in the back you can see. I mean, you cannot see because it's in the back you can see a few computers are sitting there for sure. I try to use them, but they need to go at some point.
Yeah. So when you think about that for your own self, knowing the industry, knowing your own personal data, what are you willing to pay to ensure that it's correctly and properly stewarded? And, do you go out and do you buy the data erasure software? Do you pull down some freeware, off the internet, wipe your device, and then go donate it or give it to, one of these entities that will take it for free? Or do you go to that local ITAD processor and say, hey, here's my one device. I know I might pay $15, $10, whatever it is. Do you go to Best Buy? Do you go to Staples, a retail type location? Do you donate it at one of these free events that, these companies offer in communities? I think that if people start looking at it individually and then start applying individually what they would do, now all of a sudden you can have those discussions at a corporate level to say, well, if it's reasonable for me to spend something to properly steward this and know that it's going to be used or it's going to be recycled or it's going to be repurposed, whatever the case may be, then we as an organization can do that too.
The challenge, Bo, is really how one creates a sustainable economic models for the pure play ITADs, the ones that are going to be doing this day in and day out as part of their core business. As I said earlier, I'm ruling out the OEMs, the big leasing and financing companies for the time being. I think that they are going to be dragged, into doing more and better through other means, particularly producer responsibility regulations and all these things. They will be a critical player, but they're not going to be the key driver of sort of the activities that's taking place in the ITAD space. I'm ruling out also the companies like our friends at Aero that really went out there with good intention to build an ITAD industry, but ran into all sorts of practical, financial trouble, personality issues, etc. that got in the way, simply because they have a core industry or a core business that if that core business gets hit by financial problems, automatically everything else gets hit, and therefore their ITAD unit is inevitably tied to the performance of what matters to them. If what matters to them gets into trouble, then automatically everything else could be scaled back. So what are we left? We're really left with really ITAD companies, a few of them. I mean, you can identify probably in the US market today, maybe 10, 15 companies that are at the forefront, that are probably responsible for 70% of volume. Maybe this is a
well, I think it's reasonable to say 80-20 rule, right? Exactly. 80% of the velocity is going through 20% of the suppliers.
So the question is, how do you create a business model or an economic model for these companies that allow them to sustain and continue business in a profitable way and grow and grow more? How are these ITAD companies, what kind of agreements and contracts they have? Are they hired on a sort of on a month-to-month basis whenever they're needed, or do they do annual contracts where they can easily sort of predict their financial situation 6 months, a year from now?
Well, I look at the ITAD industry this way. It's always going to boil down to whose business, who's the primary decision maker. Whether it's a large corporate entity like an Arrow or an Iron Mountain or whatever, or it's Billy Bob's computer recycler out of Waco, Texas. And by the way, that's a made-up name. How you set up your financials, how you set up your business practice is really up to you. Now, having something under contract is always preferable. There should be some type of written agreement and understanding between the two entities. And this is, again, where I push back on the ITAD suppliers to say a no invoice model is different than a no service fee model. So which is it? Are you not going to charge me a service fee at all? And so therefore, are you going to revenue share? Or is the relationship purely, I'm going to give you everything, and all of that responsibility and risk is thrust upon your shoulders, right? So you have to process them to the SOW and the SLAs. You have to go try and find the buyers. You have to take all of that. You have to play that math. Or are you going to come up and basically say, hey, here is our service fees. We believe that they're reasonable in comparison to others, right, that we compete with. And here is the model. And we feel through our efficiencies and our experience and things of that nature that, this is the deal here. And they really could, whether it's the owner of the company that's doing the sales, they hire somebody that does it specifically, having folks on contract or a consignment basis where, I'll call it a manufacturer's rep. That's what other industries call them. You're not going to ring the register if you don't have somebody out there selling. End of story. So the question is, what's more important, a marketing presence or a sales presence? A lot of people think of them synonymously, right? But they both have a unique role to do to impact the business. But at the end of the day, right, the salespeople are the ones who, ultimately work it all through.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they take the brunt of everything, good or bad or indifferent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I tell I tell my clients typically on the ITAD front, typically that if you're going to have or build a sales organization, I would recommend you do it based on vertical markets. You don't use the same language, in the healthcare sector and in the financial sector. You might have commonality, you might have common areas that are important, but ITAD in the financial sector is very different than ITAD in the retail sector. I mean, the sort of problem that we're seeing in California with a number of retailers getting into trouble, that may not be the case for a financial institution that's much more inclined to understand privacy issues, data security issues. It's a mentality. It's a culture where data security is embedded. It's an easier sell, particularly if you use the same language, if you talk about the same laws that they understand, as opposed to someone in auto manufacturing. It's completely different ball game. But that assumes that that company has the resources to build a sales organization.
Well, I'm going to add, I mean, a vertical market strategy certainly is viable. But if you're talking about individuals, right, you want to look at aptitude and attitude. Passionate people, right, if you're passionate about the industry, that passion will always shine through. If you do some basic research on your target client and show them that you understand their business, even if it's just at a high super level, especially on a cold call, or let's not even call it a cold call. We'll just say an initial call, right? Those are the types of things, right? Because people will talk to you if they like you.
Yeah.
So sales reps that are likable, they can get meetings left and right. However, people do business with people that they trust. You have to solve that business problem. You have to make it an economic viable choice, right? And so if you've got a likable person, but yet your company doesn't solve the problem, meetings don't mean anything, right? Absolutely. I mean, other than, we'll continue to educate. And then you also, as a sales rep or a business development executive, need to come back and give that feedback to the operation so that you too, as a provider of services, can expand and grow. Because, I can tell you a lot of the processes that we had on the front end. So back in that early 2000 time frame, that are now industry standards really weren't necessarily industry standards. They were best practices, and we executed on those consistently, and we got feedback from our customers consistently. And so we were always willing to adapt and adjust to meet the client's needs. And when you do that, then you know what? Hey, everybody wins. And to your point, reasonable people do reasonable things. And as I always say in my negotiations, I'm not out here as a large organization to try and put you out of business. However, right, based on the circumstances of this unique deal, how do we make it mutually beneficial to both? And that's why you see like a lot of government contracts, right, are cost plus percentages, right? Oh, well, if you can show me what your costs are, I'm willing to give you X percentage as a perceived profit, right? And that's the perception. And so that's the element that the ITAD industry holistically to this point has really not demonstrated yet. They play all these math games, and that's why every deal can be very different.
That is absolutely correct. I mean, you have different types of companies, different personalities involved, different economic models, different sales tactics that don't lead you to the same result, for sure. One question, Bo, that's sort of on a practical side. You've worked with large companies. You work with a large company for a large company now. How hard is it to manage ITAD on the global level? Is it decentralized enough so that you don't have to really worry about it? Do you put together the directives, the rule, to let folks in Asia and Europe and the EMEA region manage their relationships with third-party or ITAD vendors, for example?
Well, it again boils down to the organization that you work for,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I could even put it to the perspective of in large organizations, right? A retailer, for example. So you have retail organizations, so you have retail locations that have technologies that are deployed in it that would be qualifying for ITAD. Then you have your corporate regional offices, and that's another set of devices that are being deployed and could be managed separately. And then you have your data center, and that usually, in some cases, also is managed as its own little, P&L or entity. So now you take that and make that global. It does become very, very difficult. What my current experience is, the U.S. by far, has the highest volumes and highest velocities, has more providers out there per capita, right, than other nations in this particular space. So if we look at the certifications in the ITAD industry that are recognized as, leading certifications, we look at the ISO standards that are out there. We look at the NAID standards that are out there. We look at the tools that support those particular certification or industry standardization bodies, right? And you start building on what's generally acceptable and then apply those specifically to the markets, because it gets extremely difficult. I mean, it's hard enough in the United States to manage the 25 states that don't have e-waste laws, let alone the 25 that do. So, and then when you have a geographic disparity or location, the size and scale of the entity that I work for, in a perfect world, you would want to have all of that from a carbon footprint perspective processed locally. Now, in practicality, that's a lot of relationships to try and manage. It's a lot of contracts to try and negotiate. So then you start looking at, okay, what is the next best opportunity for getting what all we need to have done, getting the data that we need to get done, knowing that, hey, at the end of the day, right, we're doing the best that we possibly can with the resources that we have and the budgets that are available to us.
Yeah.
So all I can say is, from an asset disposition side, you have baselines that you put out there. I call them best practices. Here's the certifications that we support. However, I have peers and counterparts in other countries that they look and they say, okay, yeah, that seems reasonable, but here's a variant in our country. So we're going to apply it specifically. I mean, because in Europe alone, you've got all those cross-boundary issues with electronics. So, to try and manage that, out of country holistically for EMEA becomes very difficult.
Yeah, and you did allude a minute ago, Bo, on this siloed nature of the various big components of IT. You have, the PC, classic PCs belonging to IT management or IT departments. You have the hyperscale sort of belonging to the data center organization. You have the phones and potentially the tablets belonging to the telecom group. Has this been, or is this an issue? And I say that is because not too long ago, I organized a meeting within one company of these various groups. They never met each other before. In the same building.
That can happen. No, that absolutely is true. They will, most organizations will self-admittedly say that they're still immature, even though some are more mature than they really believe that they are. And so what I would say is, asset management, asset disposition for electronics is a golden thread among the whole information technology. So if everybody reports up to one CISO or one CIO or one CTO, then it's my humble opinion that the entity that handles the asset disposition, the asset management, is an organization that is its own entity that is neutral across all of those siloed business entities. And so we become that common golden thread and say, all right, data center, we're going to help you with asset disposition. Okay, corporate entity, we're going to help you with asset disposition. Okay, whatever the other, in the case of a retailer or a manufacturer, okay, in the manufacturing side of things, here's how we're going to help you in all of those plants, right? And that right now is not consistent in organizations that I've had an opportunity to talk to. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's not quite consistent. It's still a little bit siloed. And I think once that really truly comes together as its own seat at the table, so to speak, then boom, you're going to see a lot of this stuff fall into place.
And that's a huge headache for ITAD companies, right? In most cases, when you talk to an ITAD company, it's we want laptops, we want laptops, we want laptops.
Oh yeah, no, you are absolutely correct, David.
There are, however, probably ITAD-like companies that are not so visible, that operate under the radar, that focus on data center and hyperscale. That's probably a much more lucrative business. It could be a huge lucrative business, or not necessarily the case.
Well, this goes back to your original question, which is if I were to start an ITAD practice in my organization, where would I go? Right.
Yeah, that's a good start.
And so my first thought is if I happen to have a hardware asset management team, right, I would go to them and I would say, I need to understand exactly what's in our purview, right? And you can do that siloed, you can do it organization wide. If it means that you got to go to 2 or 3, which in my case, I've done personally in more than one instance in corporate America. So it's not that uncommon. And once you understand what's out there and then the projects, the next thing you start doing is, okay, what kind of services does this need? Meaning, does it have data? Does it need to be destroyed? Meaning, is it the type of technology, because it's so industry specific and it's intellectual property, it requires full-on destruction. So once you understand what it is that you have in your environment, now you can start putting the little pieces to say, okay, as I build my program, do I need a pure recycler? And if I send to a pure recycler in the sense that I know that it's going to get shredded and the materials that come out of that are going to be separated and they're going to be aggregated with other like things so that they feed the plastics to the folks that deal in that raw material as in the front end of the manufacturing process. That you can also look at it and say, all right, to your point, the traditional ITAD players out there are going to say, we're really good in the traditional ITAD space, right? Or the technology space, which is your printers, your monitors, your desktops, laptops, and servers, switches, network gear, things of that nature. And so when you start understanding the value on those devices and the services that are required to properly disposition them, you can start evaluating. In the case of retailers, right? Retails have registers, cash registers. They have thermal label printers, which is, some call them labelers. They have receipt printers. They have scanners. They have all of these other type of ancillary technologies that traditional ITAD companies look at and say, well, a register is really just a register, and that's kind of a specific thing. We don't know. We don't necessarily have the downstream, the market capability of that. But yet, if you deconstruct a register, guess what it has? CPU,
Yeah.
RAM, storage capabilities. So now all of a sudden it's like, well, how well do you really know the devices, right?
That's
And
right.
then the question is, so to some extent, you have to educate yourself as an individual. What are the technologies in my environment? And then how are we using them and supporting them? And then when we're ready to move on from them, what are the industry options for potential resurrection, potential reuse is what I like to call it. And to your point, yeah, there are specific companies that deal in used retail specific gear.
Yes, yeah, they're not, you're right. They are not dumb terminals as
Right.
so many people think. I mean, those point of sale terminals can be very sophisticated pieces of hardware that, to your point, ITAD companies may not be so into them. And that's a shame. I mean, it's basically how the sector is profiling in the longer run. I mean, you're going to have chips in every product
Well,
from
IoT, yeah, IoT, Internet of Things,
exactly
right?
exactly from
Um,
cars to shoes to so it's an opportunity. The way I see it is an opportunity for a savvy company that is into hardware and technology recovery. Call it what you want. Call it ITAD, call it disposition, disposal, call it whatever you want, but the opportunity is there. Final question within the same context. Um, AI, threat or opportunity or both?
I look at AI as an opportunity. Um, AI in and of itself is not good or bad. It is the intent of which it's being used. So if your intent is to be evil, well, then it's going to be evil. If your intent is good, then the result of that is going to be good. Um, I look at AI, it's not going to necessarily replace individuals in organizations. What it will do is allow to streamline some things that right now take a lot of potential manual thought
Resources, yeah.
process to actually get the end result. And so yeah, no, I look at, like, in our particular instance, AI could come in really great around predictive and analytics around repair and maintenance, especially in a wide geographic and the velocity of how our business is conducted on a daily basis. That if you can predict a problem before it happens and actually address it before it becomes a problem, now AI, absolutely phenomenal thing.
Yeah, and you could also have predictive pricing, which is really the backbone of a lot of what
Well,
this industry is all about.
what it's going to really, what AI can also do, right, is if you sit there and think to yourself, what is the valuation of a particular device in the secondary market, right? That AI is going to go look at everything. I
It's
mean,
instantaneous. Yeah.
so if you Google ITAD, right, you get over 4 million hits. So just to think about having to go stream through 4 million different potential pieces that have ITAD as part of, the makeup, right? That's just mind boggling. And then you even put in leadership, or big ITAD in the United States, and you get a couple 100,000 hits. And it's like,
Yep.
whoa, how
Pretty
do,
good
how do I
stuff.
go through a couple of 100,000
Yeah.
where AI can go through all of that based on the criteria that you set up and into it and do that research for you? Woo, man.
Mind-boggling. I think the opportunity for ITAD to shine with AI is absolutely there. The problem is obviously you need the resources to build an AI infrastructure for a company where margins are very low. It's very difficult, especially nowadays. It's very difficult to find the right talents, to compete for the right talents. You will find the talents, but you're going to have a lot of money to do, to hire data scientists. You need a lot of data, but one assumes that you have enough market data that allows you to do pricing projections. But I think, to me, the most intriguing thing, beside, of course, optimizing logistics and supply chain and all that stuff, and having cameras essentially looking at those devices and deciding what to do. I think there's an opportunity to integrate the supply and the demand IT infrastructure. I think we're going to reach a stage where basically you have an ITAD company with a savvy IT infrastructure that is built on AI that's going to basically integrate what a client wants, and you deal with, that system is going to deal with all sorts of problems. It will follow the device to the second, and it will be able to identify pricing opportunities anytime. But I think this is probably a 5 year, to your point earlier, this is going to be a 5-6 year sort of horizon. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's even earlier than that. I mean, this is moving at a fast
Well,
clip.
what would be interesting is you take the larger organizations out there, and when I say larger ITAD companies, I'm just going to say those that have the revenue that could support an AI effort. What would be really interesting, in my humble opinion, is you could take that AI and really, really understand your costs.
Absolutely.
Because you can plug in a lot of data in the things that are happening in real time. And instead of trying to figure out, because a lot of people just for the ease, they're going to segment it in or truncate something from an hour. Oh, it doesn't matter if it's 35 minutes. We're going to just say it's an hour, or it's 45 minutes, or it's 30 minutes. Whereas AI can take that and say, you know what, you processed these 5,000 devices, and here's the results of all of them. But when you look at it on an average, median, by device type, and all of this kind of stuff, here's your true cost with the factors that you plug in. That is going to be huge, huge,
Absolutely.
huge, huge. And that's where I see the organizations that have the opportunity, because, if you understand your costs, then you can build the right models, and you take this magic out of the picture. And what would also be real cool from an AI perspective is to say, hey, you know what, the devices that you're going to retire right now are in heavy demand in this region of the world, so it's going to generate exponential revenue at this point in time. How cool is that? There's just some really neat things.
Oh no! Look, I mean, the optimization that's going to take place is unlike anything else we've seen, Bo. I think what you have the intersection of a number of things taking place right now that they're going to have an enormous impact on almost all industries, including ITAD. So I think we need to be really prepared for some paradigm shift taking place. For example, the AI technology is expanding, is improving at an exponential rate. I mean, you go from 1 month to another month, you have a new version of an AI. There was one recently, and I can't remember the name of it, that was so revolutionary that they had to shut down the website because it was too much information. You have that kind of growth that is going to impact how technology is used. You have on the other side a number of sustainability funds that are generating or attracting billions, trillions of dollars in search for the next idea in the area of sustainability. And so there is going to be no shortage of investors looking to park their money and test new ideas and new technologies. The question is, which ITAD company, if any, is going to benefit? Could it be an ITAD company that is now doing the right things? Could it be a kid from a university that's coming up with an idea? Could it be a Dell or an HP? We don't know. But clearly, I think all of them are going to play a certain role, which leads me to sort of predict that by, within 5 years, we're going to come back and talk about ITAD in probably a different circumstances, totally different way.
Well, it could be very interesting. It never ceases to amaze me, the younger generations that are so tech savvy, right?
Yes.
And with these emerging AI opportunities, boy, to me, it would be interesting. To your point, is it an ITAD company or is it a platform company that creates
Could be
the
anybody.
platform for the business to support ITAD?
Exactly.
And then kind of like the operating system for ITADs, and who knows?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen, Salesforce.com and all sorts of companies that
Yep.
are now key, drivers of, behalf of companies and their sales organization and their structures. There's always something like that that could happen, but clearly, I think we're sort of identifying bottlenecks and problems. But I think in due time, the sector is going to self-regulate, driven by all sorts of technologies that are going to be extraordinary to watch.
No,
For
I
sure.
agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah,
Wholeheartedly.
I mean,
And
for us who are sort of day to day, it's fascinating to see the evolution. For most people, they probably will not see, the evolution. It reminds me of my mother. She's 80 years old. She to be used to the rotary phone. But I was concerned about the switch to a smartphone, and it was absolutely flawless. Why? Because all you need to do is press a button, and it's there, and she doesn't think about it. And I do
right.
remember my mom lives in North Africa. I do remember, 20, 25 years ago when I called her, I used to use MCI or AT&T. I don't know if you know, it used to cost me $5 a minute.
Yep.
Now it's absolutely seamless, and the transition for people that follow technology was extraordinary. For people that don't follow technology but use it, it was a breeze. It was like, it's no big deal. Sure, I can press on it and it's Skype, or nowadays it's WhatsApp, and you're in Africa in a moment, and it is wonderful. And I think this is what's going to happen to us, to the ITAD industry. You're going to see a lot of upheaval. In this case, you're going to see a lot of companies that will disappear, particularly the small ones and the ones that are very regional, that don't generate enough money, that are not thinking of ITAD as a service, but an opportunity to grab assets and sell them into the secondary market and generate some profit there. I think these companies are going to have a real hard time going forward, but that's the nature of industry, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the industry itself. I mean, I think that the key here is ITAD is a services based industry, period.
Yeah.
And a lot of people try and put a brokerage type spin on it.
Commodity thing.
They, a commodity play to it. And it's really not that at all. And
Yeah.
if you sit back and look at the different elements that are being required and requested from companies, well, the ones that jumped on those wagons a little earlier in the game, I mean, I'm trying to think. I mean, so mobile shredding's been around for a long time. It's just that it was paper. And then all of a sudden, everybody was worried about data leaking and all this kind of stuff. So somebody said, well, let's try and shred a hard drive in one of our paper shredder trucks. And then they caught the truck on fire and realized not a good idea. So, they said, oh, well, you know what, if we get a truck that's specific to hard drives, well, let's see who all would be interested in that. And now you've got an industry that continues to thrive, despite the fact that, the industry that creates the software that writes, overwrites and sanitizes these disks for, the tools there are great, but there are still some businesses that say, you know what, the risk factor is not worth it to us. We want them destroyed. That way we know we can see it physically going into something. And at the end of it, it's a whole bunch of stuff. And it's so interesting. I was just speaking at a conference recently, and it was in the shredding industry. And I don't know if you remember one of the original Batman movies with Michael Keaton, but the Penguin had, this big, long paper that, it was shreds of stuff that it was taped together, right? And he says it's amazing on what you can find out with a little patience and some tape, right? And so you think about that and go, well, is that likely? No. Is it possible? Absolutely. So then you start thinking about the shredding of the hard drives. is it likely that somebody is going to go out there and try and piecemeal together shredded pieces to get data? Likely? No. Possible? There's technology out there that could do it. And the same thing is true even with data standardization. Everybody exercises their best element of due diligence, but the technology, to your point, is exponentially growing and improving by the second. And so the minute you put something out, it can be antiquated 5 minutes later. So,
Absolutely.
I think that the ITAD industry will continue to evolve. I think that the investment community will also get a little smarter about where they're placing their money. And the reason being is that, you see in the paper all the time, oh, e-waste is growing from 52 million tons to 62 million tons to, and the reality of that is okay, well, where are you gathering this data from? And how much of that is consumer versus corporate? Because the money right now is in corporate. That's where you refine everything. And then if you can bring it to the consumer and make it convenient. I mean, a lot of people don't realize waste management has an electronic waste division.
Yes.
They don't really promote it a whole heck of a lot. But yet, if a company has the logistics to come by everybody's doorstop, they do. But yet they understand the complexities and the legal liabilities that may be thrust upon them because of data being the most valuable commodity known to man right now. And as we continue to protect and guard and wrap our arms around the data, that is where the ITAD companies again become a very important complement to everybody's IT strategies.
Absolutely. Bo, I could stay here all night and ask you questions and learn from you. And I truly appreciate your willingness to spend almost a couple hours with me, really. And I think we should probably do that a little more often.
No, I'd be happy to. It's been a pleasure getting to know you personally. And so, no, I would welcome the opportunity to anytime.